The perfume arrived on a Tuesday morning in a small amber bottle, the size of a thumb. It fit into Clara Bennett's palm like a secret warm glass. A label faded at the edges. A ribbon tied once around the neck, and knotted by hands that had forgotten yesterday's names. Her grandmother pressed it into her hand, with a seriousness that made Clara laugh. The kind of laugh you give to small, precious things, so you don't start crying instead. For special nights, Evelyn said. And Clara promised she would save it for special nights. Not knowing that some nights choose you instead. By the time the sun sank behind the downtown skyline, Clara was already a map of small compromises, college loans, double shifts, cups of coffee reheated in the staff room. Forensic chemistry was an obsession, how molecules told stories, how tiny structures could betray the truth of a crime, but reality paid in dollars. Not in discovery. Her grandmother's care cost both. Evelyn's days were a patchwork of cameos, clear moments of recognition followed by fog, so Clara learned to live on the edge of those flashes. To measure her life, in the returns of a smile. The way a remembered name could rebuild an afternoon, she dabbed the perfume once behind each ear. A private ritual that smelled like memory and old books. The scent warmed against her throat. Familiar and strange, at once an amber depth, a green spice, a translucent sweetness, like a story you almost remember. It was nothing loud, nothing meant to command a room. It was a keepsake, meant to sit in a drawer and be admired, like a photograph. Tonight, though, it slid into the air and found a nose that had lived heavy years. They had closed the private dining room for the Moretti table. The staff called them untouchables and trained new employees not to sweat the favors that came with their plates. Clara moved through the restaurant, like she always did, polite, efficient, invisible, balancing trays, remembering wine lists, apologizing for clumsy elbows. The chandeliers threw warm pools of light, and the city pressed itself into the glass, like a distant constellation. She had rehearsed the script of service so many times she could have recited it in her sleep. None of that prepared her for the moment. A man stopped breathing because of a scent. He was at the head of the table, and he belonged to the room the way a shadow belongs to an alley. Adrian Moretti did not need to raise his voice to command attention. His silence carried the weight of unfinished sentences. When he smiled, it was a calculation. When he looked at someone, the look did the work of 1,000 questions. He lifted a glass, and then froze. Like someone who had just read the margin note in an old book, and realized the page belonged to them. "Don't let her leave," he said. And it was not the bark of a man ordering someone detained. It was an order folded into velvet. The public noise thinned, and rearranged itself around him. The minor clanks of silverware, the hum of conversation, the clink of ice, each became part of a sudden, taut silence. Security lights blinked out with a little mechanical sigh. The temperature in Clara's chest went up a degree and stayed there. He walked to her, as if walking is a legal transaction, slow, precise, determining. He did not ask for her name. He did not need to. When he stopped, his presence felt like a question held close to his chest. His words were calm, in a way that made calm sound dangerous. "That scent doesn't belong to you," he said. "It belongs to my family." Clara's hands tightened around a decanter. The tray seemed to tilt, and the wine trembled in its glass, like a small animal frightened into silence. She set the bottle down because she had to. Because an instinct older than fear told her to keep her hands busy. "It's my grandmother's," she insisted. The words simple and true. "She gave it to me. Evelyn Bennett." The name acted on him like a key. Something in his face shifted, not into rage. Not into recognition exactly, but into a fracture of memory. "Evelyn Moretti," Adrian corrected softly. And the way he said it made Clara realize that her grandmother had carried two histories at once. "My brother's wife." If a name can rearrange the axis of someone's world, this was that kind of name. For Clara, it felt as if a photograph snapped in the past had been set down in front of her. A picture that matched the bottle in her pocket. For him, it read as an answer and a wound at the same time. Which means you're my niece, he said, not as accusation but as an arithmetic fact. The room breathed like a creature awakened. He took a small leather portfolio from a man who materialized at his shoulder. And inside were images and documents that read like a life she had been told in fragments. The photos were of a younger Evelyn, hair pinned back, standing beside a man whose jawline matched the one Clara had seen at the table. There were marriage certificates, dates that stitched the decades together, and a ring caught in another picture that gleamed in the same familiar way as the one on her grandmother's dresser. Clara's voice became a thread-boned thing. My mother always, she began. And the thought of explanations grew heavy and slippery. Her life had never been arranged for public consumption. It had been a map of small, private economies. She had believed in simple truths. A grandmother who loved her. A mother who worked. Textbooks stacked on a dorm room desk. The documents in the portfolio suggested one more truth, that history sometimes moves like a tide hidden. Then suddenly, unmistakably, visible, Adrian did not accuse her of lying. He offered neither wrath nor mercy in his face. Instead, he offered inventory. We know where your grandmother has been, he said. We know she was cared for. We know her name. And we know she carries a signature, an aroma our family has used for generations. There was a practicality in the way he spoke about family, as if it were a ledger to balance claims, debts, loyalties. You could have a different life, he added. The sentence both a possibility and a threat. Or you could walk into ours. Every sentence from him had weight. A deal was not a story told casually in the air. It was a contract. And contracts left marks. Come with me, he proposed then. And his voice did not rise. It did not need to. Let us help your grandmother. We can give you resources. Opportunities. We can give you answers. But if you come, you will not walk away the same. For a split second, Clara could see the future in both directions. One path was the small street. She had always walked late shifts. Cramped lap benches. A life that moved in measured, honest steps. The other path opened, like a dark, well-ordered garden power. Money. Medical care, beyond the reach of grants. And a labyrinth of secrets that might include her family, her identity, and the parts of herself she had not yet named. Love for Evelyn and scientific curiosity forges a kind of math in Clara that is ruthless in its precision. She could imagine the treatments, experimental trials, lab-grown compounds, instruments that read neurons the way a telescope reads stars. She could imagine saving the woman who had handed her a bottle tied with a ribbon. The idea was intoxicating, because it was possible. It was also dangerous, because possibility is never pure. It is always laden with cost. Adrian folded the portfolio closed and returned to the table. To a life that had its own logic of power. The restaurant allowed itself, slowly, to breathe again. But something had changed in the air, an awareness, like a footprint on a beach, where the tide had receded, but would come back differently. Clara stood with the bottle warm in her pocket. For a moment, she looked like the rest of the staff again. A familiar face, among linens and polished glass. But she was not the same woman who had walked in. The offer hung between them like a suspended note. It was not a promise. It was a turning point. Outside, the city lights blinked. Indifferent, inside, a single scent had rearranged the ledger of a life. Clara thought of her grandmother, asleep in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and sunlight. She thought of test tubes and grant applications, and a cold, clinical lab that might, with the right funding, become a place of miracles. She found her voice on the other side of the decision. "I need time," she said. Which was true, and also a thin shelter. Adrian inclined his head, as if conceding an hour or a day was part of negotiation. He did not smile. "Not really. 24 hours," he said. "We will send a car. If you come, you will see what we can give you. If you refuse," his sentence dropped off like a hinge. And Clara felt the weight of the hinge on the world. She left the room with hands that smelled faintly of perfume and wine, with a heart that had learned to carry more than it had thought possible. Behind her, the portfolio closed again. And a man who had always commanded a room returned to his quiet rule. In the parking lot, under a sky that made Los Angeles look like a circuit board, Clara wrapped her fingers around the amber bottle and imagined two futures standing opposite each other, both honest in their own ruthless way. She locked the bottle back into her bag, because some decisions, she knew, required not only courage, but time to map. The Moretti estate looked nothing like the world Clara had known. It rose out of the hillside like a promise written in glass and steel, a clean geometry against the sky, and the driveway carved a polite distance between the house and the city below. When the gate opened for her, it felt less like hospitality than admission, a threshold crossed in both directions at once. Inside, the place was all restrained light and discreet power. People moved with a kind of efficiency that suggested training and purpose, not the rough improvisation of men with guns. There were lab coats where she had expected leather, degrees where she had imagined threats, doctors, chemists, technicians, people who spoke in measured sentences about trials and assay results, welcomed her with the calm of specialists who had seen worse than nerves and more than loyalty. Adrian's empire, Clara realized, wore many faces. Crime was only a corner, and medicine another. Whole and deliberate, he met her in a corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old books. Adrian's voice was even as he guided her through a set of doors, into a lab that looked more like a research university than a criminal compound. Stainless benches, instruments she had only read about, pipettes and glassware, arrayed like a choir ready to sing. On a central table, under careful lights, sat the perfume bottle from that first night, an artifact, both tender and technical. Nearby, a screen displayed molecular models, three-dimensional ribbons of atoms folding into shape, and the words that made Clara's throat constrict, a neuroactive compound annotated with reaction pathways, binding affinities, and a shorthand for something that could, in the right dose, touch memory. Our perfumer died 30 years ago, Adrian said, and the sentence carried both regret and a kind of business-like reverence. You can bring her work and our family back to life. The proposition was simple in language and complicated in consequence. Clara had studied the way molecules behaved under stress, how binding pockets flirted and latched, how tiny changes in stereochemistry altered outcomes in ways you could predict only after you had failed a dozen times. The work Adrian proposed was, scientifically, intoxicating. The science promised an answer to what her grandmother had lost, a way to awaken synapses that had dulled with time, to coax memory into returning like a reluctant guest. She became, in short order, the lead chemist on a project that would otherwise have been a late career dream. Instruments were assigned to her. A team of specialists, neurochemists, pharmacokineticists, behavioral scientists clustered around her notes and listened when she spoke. The privilege dazzled. As privileges tend to do, suddenly, there were resources she had only skimmed in grant announcements, private collections of reagents, expedited shipment channels, instruments that made her old lab feel like a child's playset. There were also protocols that bent the rules she had once assumed, were immovable trials designed with a malleability she had never seen in peer-reviewed settings. This was a kind of science that moved faster when money and motive pushed it. And Clara felt both the fuel and the friction of it. Her grandmother's improvement came first in small, tremulous ways. A word returned to a sentence. A name that used to vanish, reappearing like a small comet. Evelyn started humming hymns she had loved as a girl. She could describe the layout of her childhood house in a way that made Clara see rooms filled with framed landscapes, and the particular way sunlight had fallen on a kitchen table. The team reported neural activity in regions previously thin on signal. The scans looked, on the right days, like little explosions of return. Clara's heart stretched in two directions, at once satisfaction and suspicion. If science could do this, then the work was righteous. But the methods accelerated timelines, selective data, filters. A curious elasticity around consent and oversight made her uneasy. Surveillance threaded the estate. Badges tracked entry and exit. Cameras sat like quiet juries. Privacy, once a given, was a currency Adrian did not accept as universal. There were also the small, human contradictions in Adrian. With colleagues, he could be distant and surgical business first, family second. With Clara, he softened in ways he rarely allowed other people to witness. He would appear in the lab, not to correct technique, but to ask a question about a polymer curve, or to offer a historical note about the perfumer who had mixed essences with medicines, long before Clara's textbooks called such blends inappropriate. He brought coffee without being asked. He lingered with comments about method choice and patient outcomes. There was a tenderness there, a peculiar, cultivated care that could have been paternal, protective, or calculated. It was easier to read at first as gratitude. He admired what she could do, but admiration, like everything else in his world, shaded into possession. "You think you can separate science from blood?" he asked her once. Not as accusation, but as observation. He stood near a hood, hands in his pockets, and the question had the edge of one presented to a jury. "You carry our scent, Clara. You are one of us." She had not expected possession to be phrased as identity. Her identity had always been a ledger of small truths. Now, someone else wrote in her account. The words sat like a token coin they conferred. Belonging, but also obligation. Belonging could mean access to the kind of care Evelyn needed. Obligation could mean the slow erosion of the choices she had once thought hers. Emotion oscillated on a cliff. Mornings were full of meticulous lab work and small triumphs, successful recreations of trace molecules. Data that held up under statistical scrutiny. Nights. The estate quieted, and Adrian's presence found new shapes. He would walk the gardens and speak about the past, like a man reciting a requiem for a life that might have been different. He told her stories about his brother, the man Evelyn had loved, about compromises and clean intentions gone wrong. His voice was low and immediate, and bits of the man he described showed in his own hands, in the way he kept his gaze on hers a moment too long. At times the attraction between them felt inevitable, like two chemical species reacting under catalytic pressure. There were moments when their conversations slid close enough to touch a hand lingering on a paper, a smile that lasted too long, a compliment that carried a weight beyond mere politeness. Clara felt the pull in the hollow between her ribs, where hope and fear met. Each small closeness eroded the boundary she had tried to maintain. Attraction became a tool, and a risk in the same breath. Desire could clarify her sense of belonging, and blur the line of consent. Then she found the documents. They were not where anyone would have expected them, a file left in a drawer, behind authorization codes, or a ledger kept by accountants who trusted only themselves. She was cataloguing old material, scanning physical archives for references, when a folder slipped loose behind a false back in a cabinet. The edges were worn, Someone had moved them often and then hidden them. Inside were transactions that did not read like charity or research funding, offshore accounts, shell companies, shipment manifests listing items, smoothed over with euphemisms components, supplies, specialty flora. There were also movements of people names, routes, clauses that read like insurance more than business. Reading them felt like stepping behind a curtain and finding a stage where the actors had been doing very different work from the one they advertised. She felt, for a moment, the vertigo of betrayal, the exhilaration of someone who uncovers that a map has been drawn over a body of water, and the horror that follows the discovery. She confronted Adrian in his office because she could not carry the knowledge without testing its meaning. Secrets are corrosive when left to fester. She did not shout. She laid the documents on his desk and let the paper speak first. What do you really want from me? My science? My loyalty? Or my silence, she asked. The question sharp and dry. Sharpened by disappointment and shock, Adrian looked at the pages. Then at her. For a long time he said nothing. As if listening to a faraway conversation and weighing which voice to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was curiously small. I want redemption, he said. The phrase landed in the room like a prayer, and an excuse. But redemption has a price. Clara sat with the sentence like a hot stone. Redemption for whom? For a family. For a name. For a man who had lost a brother. The price could be counted in complicity. In the small betrayals that accumulate into moral debt. In the lives that people like her might sacrifice to keep a machine running. Or it could be a price paid by him, by Adrian, who might be trying to atone, in a way that only power allows. The lab hummed, like an engine in the room below, oblivious to the ethical temperature, rising above. Clara felt her world narrow to the geometry of that desk, the smell of printed paper, the chill of the leather chair. Adrian's hands folded as if in prayer, and as if in calculation. She had chosen science because truth, however uncomfortable, is a compass. Now she felt the needle wobble. Outside. The estate's lights blinked with the same indifferent promise. They always had wealth. Power. The ability to hold and also to hide. Her grandmother's brief, bright recoveries sat in her mind like beacons. The work she was doing could save a life. The documents she had found could destroy more than one. Between those poles, she could see a dangerous kind of geometry, the angles of love and obligation, the acute slopes of power and temptation. She folded the papers, slid them into her bag, and felt the weight of a decision that was not yet hers alone to make. Adrian watched her, his expression unreadable, and the scent of her grandmother's perfume clung to her like a promise. The estate seemed to inhale around them. And Clara understood that the offer had shifted. It was no longer only about medical breakthroughs. It was about shape, and who would wield it. The week Evelyn slipped back into fog, felt like a betrayal of progress. One morning she hummed an old hymn. The next afternoon she stared at the wallpaper, as if it were a different country. The gains Clara had watched like fragile seedlings wilted in the burn of something she could not control. She sat beside her grandmother's bed, holding a hand that was once strong, and felt the tremor of time like wind in a thin curtain. Evelyn's voice came soft and sharp at once. The truth is hidden behind the mountain sunrise. The phrase landed between them, like a puzzle piece that had been waiting for touch. Evelyn's eyes cleared for a moment. She looked at Clara, as if remembering the outline of a face long loved. She pressed a paper-wrapped object into Clara's palm, and said, "Keep it. He wanted you to have it when you were ready." The paper peeled back to reveal a small, battered memory stick, its casing smudged with age and care. It was a thing the modern world could unlock with a single port, and also a thing that carried weight, as if it were made of lead. Clara slipped it into her bag with the same reverence she had reserved for her grandmother's perfume bottle. And when she left the room, she felt a kind of vertigo. The past had reached forward and placed a key into her hands. She did not open it in the ward. She carried it to the lab, because truth, in her life, had always first been found under the cold light of a microscope, there, in the hum of instruments and the glow of monitors. She found encrypted files, journal entries in handwriting she recognized from a faded photograph, spreadsheets that read like a ledger of good intentions and smudged compromises, audio logs, in which a man, her grandfather, spoke into a recorder with the same patient clarity he had once used to measure soil for seeds. The files told a history that had been both noble and naive. Her grandfather had kept meticulous notes on botanical extracts, on compounds that nudged the synapse and opened a window into long-buried memory. He had believed that the Moretti name could be redeemed through medicine, that science could be the tool to pull his family out of shadow. But threaded with his notes were other files, shipping manifests, coded references, lists of shell companies. The science had always been entangled with the business that paid for it. The ledger showed trades that funded research, and research that covered trades. It showed how necessity had shaped compromise, and how compromise had, in time, become industries of its own. Clara read and reread, until the lab lights blurred. The stick was not just a map to a formula. It was a map to the architecture of a family that had built itself on both healing and harm. It contained the evidence that could topple Adrian Moretti, or it could be used to remake him. The moral geometry of the discovery set her stomach to spinning. Before she could decide what to do with the files, Adrien found her. He entered the lab with a quietness that had nothing to do with stealth. He moved through the estate as if the house itself was an extension of his will. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He stood by her bench and watched the files scroll across the monitor. "You found him," he said finally. There was no triumph in his tone. Only something like exhaustion. "Why hide it?" Clara asked. The question held accusation and a plea. Why half the work with silence and the other half with papers moved to islands where no law lives? Adrian's hands found the edge of the desk. For a long moment he looked older than the man who had stilled a room with a scent. "Your grandfather tried to turn this family legitimate," he said. The sentence carried the weight of confession. He believed in a future that wore no darkness at all. "I wanted that too. I tried. I failed." His failure was not theatrical. It was practical. Rivals would not let an empire unravel overnight. Markets collapse without the right scaffolding. Enemies lurk around honest cash as well as crooked accounts. To get from where we were to where he wanted, someone had to hold things together. Sometimes that work required discretion. His eyes met hers and held. "You can finish what he started if you stay." Stay. It was an invitation and a containment. The word made a map of possibilities with borderlines. She could see. Stay could mean resources to finish the research. Clinical trials under a roof that had the money and the immunities to move faster than academic pace. Stay could mean the kind of oversight she had always dreamed of: access to data, to populations, to instruments that scaled discoveries from bench to bedside. But the same word also meant chains, loyalty, complicity, the moral taxes that come due in the currency of silence. Clara felt the ledger of her life balance in a slow, meshless tilt. On one side, the memory stick and the truth of what the Morettis had been. The files that could expose illicit trade and corruption, and could bring down powers that had protected Evelyn and given her care she would otherwise never have seen. On the other side, the possibility of curing a woman she loved, of finishing work her grandfather began, of leading a change from within, rather than burning everything to ash. She thought of the lab nights, when she had seen neurons flare bright on a screen, and felt a humility so profound, it was almost prayer. She thought of Evelyn's small, clear moments, the mountain sunrise, and how those phrases had shaped her courage. She remembered Adrian's hand offering coffee. his offhand facts about perfumers and compounds, his eyes, that sometimes softened, in ways that did not fit the public man. She was not blind to the ways he had used power. She had seen the surveillance cameras, the ledgers, the men who moved like shadows. But she had also seen him standing in the garden talking about his brother, as if confessing to a stone. She could imagine, impossibly, that he wanted to change more than he wanted to preserve. "I can expose it," she said at last. The words felt cold as they left her, like dropping something into winter water. "I can hand the files to authorities, to journalists. I can blow the doors off everything you built." Adrian's answer was not immediate. When it came, it was the kind of honesty that unmoored her a little more. "If you do that," he said, "you will save no one. My enemies will use the chaos to bleed the family dry. Research will stop. Evelyn will be moved to worse hands or worse hospitals. The work your grandfather started will die in bureaucracy and in courts. Is that the change you want? A corpse of a legacy and a pile of good intentions?" She swallowed. The logic was brutal. The choice he presented was not between villainy and virtue, but between two kinds of loss. One was clean and righteous, and would put the world in order according to law. The other was messy and moral grey. But it might, if steered carefully, build a bridge between intent and substance. Clara thought of the memory stick again. The way the files sat like seeds. She could plant them in public and let them burn, or she could plant them behind glass and let them grow into something deliberate and alive. She imagined herself not as a pawn, but as a gardener, with permission to prune the vines. The thought of steering the family's resources toward legitimate medicine felt like a dangerous hubris and a possible redemption. "I'll stay," she said. The words were heavier than any she had spoken before. "But not as your pawn." She set the stick on the desk between them, like an offering and a contract. "As your partner, I will take over the pharmaceutical division. I will publish where I can. Create transparent trials. Bring in external oversight when it matters. I will rebuild this family the right way." Adrian's face registered surprise. Then a slow, almost reluctant relief. For a long moment he was a man who had been offered a map out of a maze. "Terms?" he asked, as if negotiating the price for redemption was something both inevitable and proper. "Full control over research direction," Clara said. "Independent ethics review boards. We can't manipulate. Public-facing partnerships. We can't hide behind shell companies. No more unaccountable shipments. You keep your networks for the things I can't." She hesitated. "For the protection we need in a world that won't let us change without enemies. But you will not use the science to leverage harm. Ever." She felt the room shift, as if she had moved the furniture in it. Adrian nodded. Slowly. "The way a man accepts new rules and measures their risk." "And if you fail," he asked, "then you'll answer for it," she replied, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "And I'll answer for it too." The admission felt oddly like breath. The months that followed were the kind of work that erodes and builds in equal measure. Clara pored over assays and trials, fought for disclosure, where secrecy had been a reflex, and learned the slow art of bargaining with power, without being consumed by it. There were nights when the estate seemed to hold its breath, when threats came in coded messages, and when enemies tested the seams she was sewing. There were also mornings when Evelyn recited a line from a lost poem, and looked at Clara, as if seeing a daughter for the first time. The perfume bottle remained on Clara's desk, like a totem, its amber glass catching light in a way that made it look less like an heirloom, and more like a relic that might still change the world. She had recreated the compound to FDA-ready standards in principle, an achievement that made grant committees hum and university labs call with offers. She had also learned how to balance transparency with survival, how to let light in without inviting ruin. Sometimes, in quiet hours, She would hold the recreated bottle and think of how power smells. It smelled of cedar and spice and a certain honeyed warmth that could soothe or strangle depending on the hands that used it. Power smelled sweet at first, an intoxicant that promised goodness in the tincture, but sweetness, she had learned, is not the same as purity. The scent sat between cure and curse, on an evening where the city below bled gold into violet. Clara stood by the estate window with the bottle in her palm. The skyline was a constellation of favors and compromises, of people she did not know, and choices she had made. She had chosen the long path, the one that required patience, vigilance, and the courage to be both tender and ruthless. When the work demanded it, she put the bottle down softly, like setting something living into its place. Power smells sweet, she thought. And then she realized it had been inside her all along, an insistence to save, to fight, to know. The perfume had not given her the scent of belonging. It had reminded her of who she could be when belonging came with responsibility. She had a legacy to rebuild, and she would begin, one careful experiment at a time. If this story moved you, if you felt Clara's struggle, her courage, her impossible choice between love and power, don't just let it end here. Hit that like button to keep her story alive. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because every week, a new chapter in the world of power, secrets, and forbidden love awaits you. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Clara? Would you expose the truth, or rebuild the empire from within? Your thoughts, your voice, your emotions, they inspire the next story. Thank you for watching The Scent of Power. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and never underestimate the power of choice.